Every single state in the US has at least one serial killer, if not multiple, which is horrifying. So today I'm going to tell you guys about the worst serial killer in Kentucky. And he was dubbed the Angel of Death. And earlier in the week, I focused on the state of Ohio and told you about Anthony Sowell. And technically this serial killer also operated in Ohio. About half of his victims were actually killed in Ohio. But he killed the other half in Kentucky. That's where he originally started. So today we were talking about Donald Harvey. And again, he was called the Angel of Death. Donald was born in Hamilton, Ohio in 1952. His parents' names were Ray and Goldie, and he ended up having two younger siblings. From age 5 all the way until his adulthood, he was being essayed by two different people. One was his uncle, and the other was like an older neighbor. I think it was like an older teenager or something like that. And in the 9th grade, he actually ended up dropping out of high school. He eventually went on to get his GED, but again, he just had like a really rough beginning of life. In 1969, so he would have been about 17 at this point, he started dating a man named James Peluso. It seems like it was maybe a secret and pretty casual, but just remember that boyfriend because he will show up later in the story. May 11th of 1970, when Donald was 18, he started working at a hospital called Marymount in Kentucky, and he was working as an orderly. And this is around the time he was essayed by his roommate named Randy White. And we're going to see a pattern with Donald that anytime something really tragic happens in his life or he is coping with something really uncomfortable, that is when he starts to kind of go on a spree. And so pretty quickly after he was essayed by his roommate, he ends up killing his first victim. He had only been working at the hospital, by the way, for 2 weeks at this point. He was supposed to be taking care of an 88-year-old named Logan Evans, and apparently at some point the patient Logan ended up smearing feces on Donald. And whether or not that was on purpose or not, I couldn't quite tell, but Donald took this really poorly, and he ended up smothering him to death with a pillow. Same exact day, Donald went to take care of another patient. He was 69 years old. His name was James Tyree, and he accidentally gave him the wrong catheter size. And when James started shouting to take it out, Donald panicked and started to use the heel of his hand to suffocate James. James ended up vomiting blood and dying, so that's 2 deaths in 1 day, and he's only been at this hospital for 2 weeks. But for whatever reason, I don't know if they just seemed like natural deaths or what, both of these guys were on the older side and were having other health issues. So for whatever reason, no one really suspected foul play or any issues when both of these men died. 22 days later, on the 22nd, he struck again. This time, it was completely on purpose. It was more premeditated. So a 42-year-old woman named Elizabeth Wyatt, she was in the hospital being treated for cancer, and she needed to be on oxygen at all times. And Donald said that he killed her out of mercy because he saw she was dying, he saw she was suffering, and he wanted to put her out of her misery. He ended up giving her an oxygen tank that was pretty much empty, and eventually she ended up suffocating. She wasn't discovered dead until like 4 or 5 hours after he did this by another nurse. And coincidentally, soon after this, they discovered in the hospital some faulty oxygen tank equipment, and someone else died from the faulty equipment. And so they thought that Elizabeth's death was connected to that. And so they just chalked it all up to faulty equipment. And so the hospital ends up moving on from this, and Donald takes all the faulty equipment he can get his hands on, and he saves it for himself so that he can use it again on future patients and victims. The following month, on July 10th, Donald was taking care of a 43-year-old patient named Eugene McQueen. He had been hospitalized for congested lungs, and Donald ended up turning him face down, and he made him suffocate in his bed. Eugene couldn't move on his own, so when he turned him upside down, he just suffocated. After he had died, Donald told another nurse that Eugene didn't look too good and that he was worried about the state of his condition. So the nurse told him to continue care, and so Donald decided that the best way to seem like Eugene was still alive was to give Eugene a bath. But he actually got caught bathing this man who was deceased, and you would think that this is when he would be caught for this murder, the other 3 murders, and be arrested, but no. For whatever reason, they actually thought this was funny. I think that what the hospital staff thought happened was that this young kid found his patient dead and panicked and just bathed his body, or didn't know he was dead and just bathed his body, because at this point he's freshly 18 and this is like his first hospital job. He's less than a few months in. All the hospital staff thought he was innocent and were able to laugh about it. The hospital itself covered up the fact that he bathed a dead guy, and all of his coworkers just thought he was like young and nervous, and so it became a running joke at his hospital that he bathed a dead guy. They just didn't realize he had killed him first. 2 days later, he killed an 82-year-old man named Harvey Williams by using the faulty oxygen equipment again. And on July 28th, he killed an 81-year-old man named Ben Gilbert. It was believed he died in the hospital from peritonitis, but we find out that he was being really difficult with Donald. At one point, the patient had actually hit Donald over the head with a bedpan and then like poured urine all over him. It sounds like maybe he was suffering from dementia or something like that. And so he had been kind of violent with Donald, and Donald had retaliated. Ben, the patient, had told multiple nurses that Donald was being really rough with him and violent. And it turns out that a few days before Ben died, Donald had put a thin wire coat hanger through his catheter, and so when he put the catheter in Ben, he ended up puncturing Ben's stomach, and this caused an infection. Ben ended up going into shock. He was in a coma for multiple days, and then he ended up dying. But because no one knew this, no one suspected foul play, the guy was already pretty sick, so they had no idea that Donald had killed him. They thought he just died of natural causes / old age and his infection. So now we are up to 6 victims in only a few months, and that's a really scary timeline because a lot of times it takes serial killers a while to escalate, but he's already killed 6 people in a very short window of time. Around this time, he also started to see a man named Vernon Midden. Again, it was a casual relationship. I think it was also a secret because Vernon was married with kids, I think. While they were dating, though, Vernon started to show Donald some more adventurous stuff, like adult stuff, and he got him into smothering, and he kind of like introduced him to what happens to the body when it's starting to react to lack of oxygen. Vernon also was in some sort of a cult, and even though he wouldn't let Donald actively participate, he introduced him to it, and it became like a big fascination for Donald over the years. On August 15th, a woman named Maud Nichols came in from the local nursing home with bed sores. She was 64 years old. She goes into the hospital that he is working at, and apparently whoever had been taking care of her neglected her so bad there were literally maggots in her wounds, which is horrifying that some woman had to endure this. And so no one at the hospital really wanted to like help her. Obviously they were, but everyone was complaining because it was something that they felt was gross. And so Donald decided he wanted to mercy kill her too. He also used the faulty oxygen tank and valve, and she died. This was after he tried to smother her with a pillow, and someone was walking by and he thought he was going to get caught, so he stopped and then swapped to using the faulty equipment. 15 days later, on August 30th, he ended up killing a man named William Bowling, who was 58. He came into the hospital with a heart attack, and Donald was told to give him oxygen, but he never did. But he killed William because he wanted to end his struggle to breathe. And again, he claims that this was a mercy killing. November 4th, he killed Viola Reed Wyron. She was 63. He originally tried to smother her with a pillow, and then there was a plastic bag over the pillow so that she wouldn't get the fibers in her lungs. He almost got caught and ended up using the faulty oxygen tank to have her suffocate instead. Just over a month later, on December 6th, he killed 91-year-old Margaret Harrison. She was being treated with multiple different medications, including Demerol, codeine, and morphine, and he gave her too much and made her overdose on all 3. 1 month later, on January 6th of 1971, he used the same faulty equipment of the oxygen tank that he's been using now multiple times on an 80-year-old named Sam Carroll, and he suffocated as well. So clearly he is really enjoying, and I hate to say enjoying, but that is what he was doing. He's really enjoying the suffocation method for killing his victims. 9 days later, he also killed a woman named Maggie Rollins by suffocating her. A week after that, he used the faulty oxygen tank again to kill a 62-year-old named Silas Butner. 3 days after killing Silas, on January 26th, he killed John V. Combs the same way. That's already 14 people he has killed virtually undetected. No one is suspecting him. Keep in mind, that's 14 that we know of. It's so incredibly possible that there are far more victims out there that he either killed on purpose or accidentally, because it sounds like he was just negligent at his job anyways. So likely he killed more people than this. They're just the people that we actually know he killed. Around the same time, so the beginning of 1971, he is struggling with his relationship with that Vernon guy. It's turning messy and bad, and he ends up starting to fantasize about embalming Vernon, which is a big deal because this is the first person outside of the hospital and his patients that he's thinking about killing. On March 14th of 1971, he killed 91-year-old Milton Bryant Sacer, who he made overdose on morphine. He had panicked and tried to get rid of the needle that he had used on Milton, and he tried to flush it down the toilet. It wouldn't flush, and maintenance found it. For whatever reason, no one connected it to Milton's death or to Donald. Soon after that, in 1971, he was arrested for burglary and intentional fire setting, but he got out at some point and then drunkenly slept with a woman named Ruth Ann Hodges, and 9 months later, she ended up having a baby. She claimed it was Donald's, and throughout his life, sometimes Donald claimed it was his kid and sometimes he denied it, so we really don't know. But after this, in June, he ended up enlisting into the U.S. Air Force, and he was only in for 9 months because they ended up discharging him after he tried to himself twice. This entire time that I've been telling you the story, he has been struggling to cope with his past, the essay and the trauma of his childhood, the essay from his roommate, the relationship struggles that he's been dealing with, and then also feeling shame about being homosexual. And he just had a really rough time mentally, and it was definitely showing in his personal life and then obviously in his career because he's literally murdering his patients. In 1972, he started working at a hospital called Cardinal Hill Convalescent Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky. He was there for about 5 months full time, and then another 2 years on and off, and to our knowledge, he didn't kill anyone at that hospital. Throughout the next few years, like 1972 to 1978-ish, he was in and out of relationships and became more and more interested in the occult that Vernon had originally introduced him to. In 1975, he got a job at a VA hospital in Lexington, and he was treating one patient named Joseph Harris, and he reduced his oxygen and Joseph died. We don't know for sure if he killed him on purpose, but it seems likely. We also know that James Twitty, James Ritter, Harry Rhodes, and Sterling Moore all died in the same ward, and Donald has said since that he thinks he killed these people, but he can't remember any specifics. So there's 5 people that they think could be his victims, and when eventually he's caught and police are asking him about that, he's like, I just can't remember because I've killed so many people. So that's horrifying. He is, by the way, only 23 at the time, so he's killed at least 15 people, probably more like 20 plus victims at only 23 years old. In 1975, he ended up joining that occult. In 1980, he started dating a guy named Doug. They had a rough relationship, and at one point, he started to put arsenic in Doug's ice cream. And this is the first person that he actually tried to kill outside of the hospital setting. He had fantasized about it with Vernon, but now he was actually trying with Doug. Fortunately for Doug, it never actually worked. He never used enough arsenic, and Doug survived, and they ended up breaking up. After dating Doug, he started to date a man named Carl, and they ended up moving in together. And Carl often would have to go to work throughout the week, and on Mondays particularly, he would be gone for extra long. Donald ended up finding out that Carl wasn't actually working late, but playing around with other men. And so instead of breaking up, Donald just decides that the proper thing to do is to start poisoning him with arsenic, so he is too sick to leave the house and too sick to see other men. Donald is getting more and more controlling at this point because Carl also had a friend named Diane. Donald was super paranoid that she was trying to break them up, and so he ended up stealing hepatitis B from the hospital, and he gave it to her. And then he also tried to infect her with AIDS that he had stolen from the hospital, but that didn't work. And then he also poisoned her with acrylic acid. It sounds like she didn't die from any of this, but like he really tried with her. On April 10th of 1983, he is now in Ohio, by the way. He has now moved back. So all of that happened in Kentucky. That's where he got his start. And I believe he ends up bouncing back and forth between states. It's believed he could have like bounced back and forth and killed people undetected. And that's part of the reason he was crossing state lines. More or less from now on in the story, he's in Ohio. So a woman named Helen Metzger, who was 63, had an argument with Donald. I think they were friends, or they lived near each other, or they were roommates or something like that. And after the argument, Donald ends up giving her arsenic multiple times over multiple different weeks. At one point, he put arsenic in her mayonnaise. After a while, she became paralyzed and ended up hemorrhaging and dying. He says that he thought she was a threat to Carl and that he didn't mean to kill her, just severely like harm and paralyze her. But now this is the first person he has killed outside of the hospital setting. At Helen's funeral, her family went to her home and ended up making food and were like mourning the loss of their family member, and they ended up using the mayo that he had poisoned with arsenic, and they all got sick. Fortunately, no one died, but it turns out they all had arsenic poisoning and just had no idea. They all thought they just got food poisoning. The next month, Donald killed Carl's father, his boyfriend's father, Henry Howler, with arsenic. And I'm assuming Carl had no idea what's going on, obviously. And then he accidentally killed a man named Howard Vetter, who's Carl's brother-in-law, because he left a poisonous solution of like wood alcohol, which is something that you use to remove labels on bottles. And he had left it in a vodka bottle, and Carl gave some to his brother-in-law. In September of 1984, while working at the hospital in Ohio, he killed Hiram Profit on accident by having him overdose on heparin. Again, no one suspected any foul play. No one knew he accidentally killed him, and no one at the new hospital knew about him like bathing the dead guy from before or anything like that. So everyone just thought he was a young kid who was helping people out. Again, no one suspected him in the slightest. Also in 1984, he ended up killing his first boyfriend I mentioned, James Peluso. In March of 1985, a neighbor of Carl's, his name was Edward Wilson, he starts to accuse Carl, the boyfriend, of cheating him on the utility bill. So Donald, who's 32 now, by the way, puts arsenic in his Pepto-Bismol and kills this guy over a squabble over a utility bill. 1985, Donald is still dealing with depression and like poor mental health and all these different things, and he ends up joining the National Socialist Party. So not only is he a murderer, he's now a neo-Nazi as well. In July of 1985, he got fired from that hospital because they ended up finding a gun in his bag, which he later says he thinks Carl planted. So it sounds like Carl was starting to suspect Donald. Again, people are dropping like flies around him, and it's all from arsenic poisoning, which he didn't really know they were being poisoned with arsenic, but he did know that multiple people were dying suspiciously. And so I wouldn't be shocked if he started to suspect Donald and was trying to get him caught. In 1986, so the following year, he started at a new hospital in Cincinnati, Ohio, and no one was suspicious about the past deaths. No one was suspicious about either time that he left a hospital. He just was hired and he started killing again. So on April 8th of 1986, he killed Nathaniel J. Watson. He was 65 years old and he smothered him with a bag. Less than a week later, he killed 64-year-old Leon Nelson with a wet plastic garbage bag liner. 5 days later, he killed 81-year-old Virgil Weddle by giving him rat poison in his pudding. This is also around the time that he and Carl broke up, and he took it incredibly hard and definitely started to escalate. Again, there's a pattern where when something hard happens in his life, he kind of goes on a spree. The day that they broke up, he killed a 65-year-old woman named Doris Nally with arsenic in her apple juice. Soon after this, there were employee evaluations at the hospital, and he received good and adequate scores in all categories. So again, completely undetected at this point. Everyone is thinking he's great at his job, or at least just fine at it. No one is thinking he's killing people on accident, let alone on purpose. So again, he just continues to kill, and at this point, he's at more than 30 people already. He also killed Edward Travis, who was 63, by putting arsenic in his soup, and then he killed a man named Willie Johnson with arsenic. A week after Willie died, he put cyanide in the IV of 80-year-old Robert Crockett. On July 7th of 1986, he killed 61-year-old Donald Barney by giving him cyanide through his feeding tube, and then he also gave him a shot of cyanide as well, just to make sure it worked. On July 25th of 1986, he killed James T. Woods, who was 65, and on August 16th, he killed 85-year-old Ernst Frey, and he killed them both with arsenic as well. So now he's going from suffocation to poisoning, mostly with arsenic. In the final months of 1986, he ended up killing 85-year-old Milton Cantor, 74-year-old Roger Evans, 69-year-old Claiborne Kendrick, 86-year-old Albert Bowman, 85-year-old William Collins, 78-year-old Henry Cody, Mose Thompson, who is 65, Otis Day, who is 72, and 67-year-old Cleo Fish, all with cyanide, mostly by poisoning them with their food or drinks like orange juice or soup. So that's 9 more people just in September through December of that year. In January of 1987, he also poisoned Leo Parker, who was 47, by putting arsenic in his feeding bag. He did have an autopsy, so in theory, Donald should have absolutely been caught at this point. Again, he should have been caught long before this, but the autopsy, for whatever reason, they failed to find out that Leo was poisoned. And so again, Donald just skated by and got to keep killing when he totally should have been caught. In February, he killed 80-year-old Margaret Kukrow and 76-year-old Stella Lemon, both by putting arsenic in their orange juices. And he claims that a lot of these older patients were just mercy killings because he felt like you can't live a good life when you're that old and living in a nursing home or a hospital. On March 6th and 7th, he killed Joseph M. Pike, who was 68, and Hilda Lates, who was 82, both by feeding them adhesive remover. Also on the 7th, he gave cyanide to 44-year-old John W. Powell. And for John Powell, there was actually an autopsy for him. And fortunately, the doctor who was performing the autopsy knew what cyanide smelled like. And so when he started performing the autopsy on John, he immediately got the smell of bitter almonds, which is what cyanide is known for. And he immediately knew John was poisoned. He even sent off samples to multiple other labs to corroborate his theory, and multiple labs came back saying, yes, he was poisoned with cyanide. He ends up notifying the police, and they start an investigation into John's death. And Donald, along with much of the staff, was interviewed and asked questions about like John as they're trying to get to the bottom of this. And Donald even offered to take a polygraph test, but on the day that he was supposed to take it, he called in sick. Because he called in sick, the police end up being suspicious of him and they bring him in for questioning. And after playing some like good cop, bad cop and interrogating him for a while, they end up getting him to crack, and he confesses that he killed John with cyanide. He says that he felt sorry for him because he was like suffering. And then he says that John was the only person he's ever killed. He's never killed before John. So Donald was indicted and now facing trial for John's murder. And while they are investigating and looking into his past and trying to build a case against Donald, they start to realize like, oh, this guy's definitely killed more than just one person. So they end up giving him a plea deal stating that if he confesses to any and all murders that he has ever done, they will take the death penalty off the table. But if he lies about any or they find out that he left any murders out, they'll take the deal away. And so this is when he starts confessing to everything. He ended up getting charged with murder, attempted murder, voluntary manslaughter, the list goes on. And at first he pled guilty to 24 counts of murder, but eventually pled guilty to 37 murders. However, over the years after he was charged and sent to prison, he ended up confessing to killing more than 50 people. And we don't know the details about all 50. So he was sentenced to life in prison, he was rotting in prison, and in 2017 he was found severely beaten in his prison cell and he ended up dying 2 days later. And so fortunately we do not walk on the same earth as this man anymore, but he was horrific. He claims a lot of them were mercy killings. Kind of doesn't really seem like that's the case, but either way, it's horrible that he was killing all these people. At one point in an interview before he died, he had reportedly said, quote, "After I didn't get caught for the first 15, I thought it was my right. I appointed myself judge, prosecutor, and jury, so I played God," end quote.